Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 9th webinar of the ODA Learning Series 2020, co-organized by UNDP and OECD. Welcome, very special welcome to all of you who have been joining us since end of August. Thank you for showing up every week. And thank you for opening your videos as well. It's great to see some faces here. We are very, very grateful that you show up every single Thursday for 2 months already. So thank you very, very much from our side. And for those who are joining us for the first time, very, very warm welcome to you as well. My name is Saran Selenge, and I am connecting from the UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub. And as announced earlier, we are dedicating the whole of October to Greening Development Cooperation. So we last week have completed 3 webinars dedicated to green finance, where we explored tools and partnerships for getting inspiration and ideas how we could fill the financing gaps the gaps for financing environment and climate. And today we start the first of 2 webinars, which we are dedicating to mainstreaming climate and environment in development cooperation. So very welcome again. And this is a discussion that we're not starting today. If you remember, earlier in the month, we had Juan from OECD who laid out options for us as to what donor countries could do. And the 2 options that he mentioned, among others, were aligning and mainstreaming. So we will be dedicating today's webinar as well as next week's webinar into clarifying more what Juan meant when he said those are, hey, Juan, you are here. Hi, I see your name, but I don't see your face. Thanks for joining us. So so we have, before we go to the presenters, Kubra, could we have a short poll to see what are the interests of the people in the room? It always is a good indication to our speakers as to where they could focus. So from the Greening Development Cooperation webinars, I would like to learn more about alignment, or learn more about mainstreaming, or both alignment and mainstreaming. And what's the difference anyway? So please feel free to choose one of the answers. And I think it's always a nice indication to where we can highlight certain things when our speakers are presenting. All right, let's see. Do we have the results? Ooh. Both alignment and mainstreaming. And what's the difference anyway? So that's cool. That's great. So let's see if there is a difference anyways in the today's and next week's webinar. I think I hope it will be clear after we hear from the excellent speakers that we have here today with us and next week. Yes, so again, we are very truly privileged to have 4 expert speakers with us today. And that's why I don't want to say any more words about having, introductions or anything. And I want to jump straight into our agenda for the day. First off, we have Özlem and Caroline. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here today with us. And Özlem and Caroline are both coming from our partner and co-organizer of the ODA series from OECD. They're both policy analysts in the OECD's Development Cooperation Directorate, and they're working on green finance and investment. And they have both co-authored the flagship report of OECD on aligning development cooperation and climate action, the only way forward. So please, let's see. Without further ado, would like to give the floor to you, Özlem and Caroline. Who would like to go first from you? And let's hear what's the only way forward.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. Merhabalar from Paris. And thank you very much for the invitation, which my colleague Caroline and I have very gladly accepted. As you mentioned, we have been co-authors of a report from the OECD, which is this one. This is what we learned at the OECD to also showcase our reports. Yes, it's called Aligning Development Cooperation and Climate Action, the Only Way Forward. At the OECD, we have had a few discussions on this title, but we kept going back to this one that we have in the end chosen, because there is such an indivisible link between climate action and sustainable development. There is really only one way forward for development cooperation if they want to build on the sustainable development gains of the past and support developing countries in their sustainable development pathways. So that's where this title is coming from. And before I pass the floor to Carolyn, I would have one question to the participants. Does anybody know which anniversary is coming up on December 12th this year or every year? I don't know if it's open to everyone to answer, but does anybody have an idea of the anniversary that's coming up December 12th?
People are free to unmute their mic and answer. I think there may be some virtual prize, no? Or they can always, you know, we can always think of something. Paris Agreement, what?
Exactly. Exactly. And that's just to say it is the Paris Agreement, but just to say that this really is on aligning development cooperation and with the Paris Agreement, which is on climate change. So obviously there are other environmental crises, including in the biodiversity space, that development cooperation also needs to address and tackle. But within the scope of this report, at least we weren't able to address all of them. So in the presentation, we focus. With that, I would hand over to Caro.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Özlem. And if we can share the presentation. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, we'll start with this slide. So just to, of course, establish what we're speaking about when we're talking about aligning with climate action, we are talking about the Paris Agreement, and especially the objectives laid out in Article 2.1 related to mitigation, adaptation, and financing. And we go beyond simply Article 2.1c in the report, because development finance does more than just provide finance. And it's also very important in terms of providing policy support and capacity development that is key to supporting developing country parties to meet mitigation and adaptation goals. And so when we if we were to kind of pose the question as to why non-alignment is a problem and why is it the only way forward, it essentially makes the mandate of development cooperation that much more difficult, if not impossible, because it increases losses and damages and poverty and vulnerability. And we know this from the estimates from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and from the World Bank. But I want to spend a bit more time on the next slide on what Paris alignment means for development cooperation, because I think it gives a bit more clarity on what we're talking about here. So in the report, we propose 4 characteristics of Paris-aligned development cooperation. And I think it's worth clarifying and making note of the fact that these are intended to be complementary and pursued in unison, and not taken separately or picked and chosen at per se. They're supposed to be taken as a package, so they rely on each other in that regard. So if we kind of just start with the first characteristic, so that we can kind of establish what we're getting at for each one. When we say that Paris-aligned development cooperation does not undermine the Paris Agreement, this is often applied to the mitigation space in terms of do no harm. But we clarify in the report, or we lay out in the report that it applies both the mitigation, whether that means using the least carbon emissions technology or practice available or possible, but also for adaptation in terms of not investing into maladaptation that could cause more harm than good, or waste investments by failing to be sufficiently resilient. And then when we say that Paris-aligned development cooperation contributes to the transformation, we're not intending to imply that all things will necessarily contribute to the transition, but activities should either not undermine or contribute to the transformation needed, with the transformation aspect kind of asserting that it's insufficient for development cooperation to simply do no harm for all activities, as a systemic shift is only possible when actively pursued. And as we kind of said before, it's these kind of low emissions, climate resilient pathways are the only way forward in terms of fulfilling development mandates, because failing to do so makes development very difficult, if not impossible. So kind of moving to the second characteristic, when we talk about catalyzing countries' transitions to low emissions, climate resilient pathways, we are recognizing that development finance as a resource alone cannot solve the climate crisis. It's not enough, whether in terms of activities or in terms of just financing to solve the climate crisis. But what development finance can do is that it can be used strategically, especially concessional resources, to support policy and develop capacities in a way that triggers broader change that can then be led by partner country actors or other actors. And in that sense, development cooperation that is Paris aligned needs to be catalytic. So moving on to the third characteristic, when we're talking about supporting the climate action processes under the Paris Agreement, we're really focusing on the role of development cooperation in developing, financing, and implementing nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and long-term low emissions strategies. And focusing on these documents are also very much key to ensuring that support for climate action is country driven, as these are established by partner country governments, and really outlines their own ambition and intention in that regard. So then when we talk about the final characteristic on responding proactively to evidence and opportunities, we're really recognizing the need for continuous assessment in terms of what level of action is required and what is possible. Of course, research when it comes to climate change, whether that's the technologies available or the nature of climate change and its impacts is constantly changing. And so really establishing that providers need to operate on updated information on the pace and scale of climate change and its impacts, and the needs and circumstances that could be changing in communities and in sectors. And this is especially important for adaptation purposes, as well as operating using up-to-date technologies, price models, and knowledge of what is accessible and possible in terms of technologies and good practice solutions. So maybe I'll kind of conclude this slide by mentioning that these characteristics are intended to be applicable at various levels and in different contexts and scenarios. So whether you're an emerging donor or one that has been established for some time, you can use these characteristics as a starting point for aligning your development cooperation activities. But now I'll hand off to Özlem again, who will speak more on the recommendations laid out in the report for how to align development cooperation.
Yes, thank you, Caro. Yes, as Carolyn has alluded to at the beginning, the task of development cooperation providers, as we see it, is to eliminate these inconsistent inconsistencies between the top-down goal of the Paris Agreement, which is set out in the temperature goals, the 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of global warming, and the climate action processes of countries under the Paris Agreement. And we've taken a little bit of a step back, and this is where we are with this slide now, and broken this core challenge down into like bite-sized pieces so that it becomes a little bit more tangible, let's say, for development cooperation providers on what this actually means, like eliminating this inconsistency. We have looked at, in our report, at challenges, and then vis-a-vis these challenges, we've developed priority action areas. And these challenges and priority action areas, as we have defined them, they exist at 3 different levels. One is alignment needs to happen at home, so in the countries of the donors, of the development cooperation providers. So that what we're asking for development cooperation providers to do in our report is to really look at the overarching strategies and policies of the development cooperation provider and see if they're really set up to support ambitious climate action in developing countries. So, for example, look at the mandates, look at the incentive systems. Are development cooperation providers, practitioners really asked to do what is needed in terms of support for climate ambition in developing countries? Do they have the right capacities? Do development cooperation providers have the right tools in place? So that's aligning at home. The second level is aligning in developing countries. So what we're asking for development cooperation providers again to do is look at their overall operations in developing countries. And because of the broad implications of climate change, it's not really an environmental issue anymore. It's really an all of society, all of economy, all of government issue that needs to be tackled. So what we're asking for is that development cooperation providers support a broad range of actors in developing countries to plan, finance, and implement the transition to low emissions, climate resilient pathways. And that, for example, could be that development cooperation providers support the core entities and governments of developing countries to implement or to integrate climate action in development plans, in sector policies, but also, for example, when you're developing financial systems so that climate is already integrated there. And the last level is aligning at the system level, because what we need is not just 1, 2, 3, 4 development cooperation providers to align, but we need to align the entire international development finance architecture. So that's broadly speaking. And then on to the next slide, so there are various approaches emerging of development actors, of development cooperation providers in aligning for Paris. We have classified them into 2 approaches. One is bottom up, the other one is top down. We'll first start with bottom up. An example for this is AFD, so the French Development Agency. They have developed what they term a sustainable development analysis mechanism that is applied to each and every project that they want to undertake. These analysis includes 6 dimensions. One is on the low carbon transmission, and the other one is it's a dual objective, a dual dimension. One is on the transition and resilience. Then you also have well-being, social progress, gender diversity, etc. And importantly, there's another dimension that's on biodiversity and natural resource management. So really, they're putting an emphasis on environmental aspects there. Yes, so that's applied to each and every project. AFD defines the scope for climate action with the national determined contribution that is set out under the Paris Agreement, which is good for country ownership, but also development cooperation providers also need to raise the ambition of this country climate action process. Yeah, so that would be a bottom-up approach where we start with projects and then scale that up basically. The next slide.
Soon, sorry, Özlem.
Yeah, last slide. The next slide is a top-down approach example of FMO. FMO is the Dutch DFI, so Development Finance Institution. It's heavily focused on mitigation, which is also the focus of the institution. They start out with the top-down goal of the Paris Agreement, so that's the temperature goal. Importantly, they don't use the 2-degree goal, they use the 1.5-degree goal. From there on out, they know where we are right now. What is the carbon budget that is still remaining to get us to 1.5? And then they calculate the fair share of the activities that they are planning to in order to reach this carbon budget that's available globally to achieve the 1.5 temperature goal. And that then defines the individual projects. Yeah, so that's in a nutshell. And that would be it for us. I think that was the last slide. And then I guess rather than jumping now into question and answers, we go to the next presentation, right?
Yes, I think that's exactly what I was going to suggest, because I think we want to hear from all our speakers, and that's why, sorry, I was saying we need to wrap, because we definitely want to hear from Ulrika and Bernard, and I think it will be nice to have the Q&A afterwards. But thank you to both of you, Caroline and Özlem. I think it was very clear why it's the only way forward, and I think it'll become even more clear as we go forward. So may I hand the floor to Ulrika now. Ulrika, welcome again, and thank you so much again for joining us. As just a very, very brief introduction, Ulrika is the lead policy specialist on environment and climate change at SIDA. SIDA needs no introduction, I am very sure of that. And she is one of the 5 lead policy specialists for 5 prioritized areas in Swedish development cooperation, with the overarching responsibility both externally and internally in this thematic area. And Ulrika has 20 years of experience in development cooperation and environment and climate change in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Middle East. And we are very, very happy to that you could join us today, Ulrika. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to be speaking to you all and with you all about these important issues of both alignment and also mainstreaming. Well, I will start with this picture. In our letter of appropriation to SIDA from the government, we got an assignment this year to analyze and explain what lessons our authority has learned so far and what further measures are needed to ensure that Swedish bilateral development cooperation is even more in line with the Paris Agreement. And as we heard, there are from the OECD and their excellent report, they have made attempts to sort out what it means and when development cooperation is aligned with the Paris Agreement. But there are very few other donors who've actually, apart from what Carol mentioned of the French and the Dutch, who have attempted to look at this more deeply. So with a lot of work, we dug into this, we're digging into this task we got in the letter of appropriation to look at our part of development cooperation and alignment with the Paris Agreement. We handed in the report to the Swedish government by 1st September, and we are now awaiting a response and see what the next steps will be. Next, please. So why does this matter? I think it was as we heard earlier, I mean, every fraction of a degree matters. This is just to remind ourselves that it's extremely important in all of a society approach, including development cooperation, how far we can get in our work on climate change. Next, please. And just also another reminder, there was recently a new study by the World Bank noticing that, or pulling out that climate change pushed another 130 million people on Earth into extreme poverty in just 10 years. And that, of course, will have great implications. And it's much related to food production, to health, and many aspects that climate change will impact in society. Next, please. So in the assignment we got, as I mentioned earlier, it said that we should analyze and explain what lessons we've learned so far and what further measures we are needed to take. We also got indirectly a bit of a task through the climate policy bill which was adopted by the Swedish Parliament in June 2020. It said, in addition to the targeted climate effects in bilateral development cooperation, it is of great importance that other elements of development cooperation are also in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and thus do not include support for fossil fuels. Next, please. And so when trying to look at this, we decided to do it in 3 parts and an appendix on fossil elements as part of our report. We started off with a background chapter that provides an overview of the Paris Agreement and starting point for our analysis. And given the uncertainty that exists with regard to definitions and paths and concrete examples of what it means to achieve coherence with or alignment with the Paris Agreement, CEDA tried in the report to describe the contribution of our development cooperation. And the starting point for us was Article 2C of the Paris Agreement, that financial flows must be made compatible with a path towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And first in the report, we did a description of our work with the integration of environment and climate change as one of the 5 perspectives that should be integrated into everything CEDA does according to our instruction. And we start off in the report with an explanation of the tools that CEDA has today and which enable the integration of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, but also our policy and action plan, etc., guiding our work. And then in the in-depth study and analysis of the 3 relevant areas, we decided then to look at our multi-bilateral support, an analysis of climate integration and initiative with potential climate impact, and the transformative potential of efforts in CEDA's assessment process. And I just also on the fossil elements, I want to mention that within CEDA's development cooperation, no support is given to the extraction of fossil energy or direct support for the generation of electricity based on fossil fuels. But CEDA's cooperation partners buy and use diesel-powered generators in areas where no other alternatives are available, or where the electricity supply is too unreliable, for example, and foremost in our humanitarian aid. And this chapter or the appendix highlights our support to Eastern Europe when it comes to energy efficiency support, and also highlighting what's in the Green Deal. We also look at Sub-Saharan Africa and how we work there with renewable energy and energy efficient cooking, and also highlights our humanitarian support. Next, please. And then in our analysis, we look then at for the multi-bilateral support on how we can integrate normative dialogue, integrate climate change and work more with normative dialogue in that support. And also in climate integration in programs, we look at our standpoint is the markers according to OECD DAC, and we try to look at the markers that we had programs marked with a 0, which means they have no relation to environment and climate change. And then so also we try to look at programs with transformative potential and marked with 2 according to as a main objective climate change, and also in relation to the OECD DAC criteria developed that was just mentioned before this. So we looked on the transformative programs. We tried to look at the transformative potential, the catalytic, and the supporting and responding potentials of those programs. And next, please. In our conclusions, looking at these 3 different areas, we found that the main tool for integrating climate change and taking into account the ambition of the Paris Agreement is that mandatory environmental assessments, included climate change, are carried out for all our programs in all sectors. And this is already a requirement according to our instructions. But in addition to this, there is a need to continue working on initiatives that have not been marked at all for environment and climate change, according to our statistical system, to ensure that they do not have a negative impact on the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement. And we have all the tools, but we also need to strengthen our compliance. The second conclusion is that CEDA can also already in the preparation phase make an assessment of whether the program has the potential to support the work of the climate focusing on the climate challenge. And for this, we need to develop and clarify CEDA's assessments tools, and for example, include the criteria developed by the OECD that was just mentioned, and the efforts that have been marked with 2 as a main objective on climate, and learn from these and also show the way for other sectors. And then finally, we also saw that there's a great opportunity to develop an even higher profile in terms of environment and climate dialogue with our multilateral organizations, both with the UN organizations, but also the development banks. And to do this in the most efficient way possible, we need to increase knowledge about the multilaterals, work with environmental and climate integration. We also need to push the issues in existing forums and raising the normative dialogue more clearly in the UN. So this is what we found through our analysis. Next, please. And finally, I would just like to end with mentioning that we have a lot of tools and material online available for our partners, but also other donors and other interested colleagues, where you can find how we look upon both, well, environment and climate change integration in our work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ulrika. That was excellent. And just for clarification, colleagues, that we asked Ulrika to focus on specifically alignment issues. Otherwise, we could have easily filled 1 hour with talking about CEDA's work and the tools that you just kindly shared now on mainstreaming environment and climate in your work. So I would encourage everyone to check out the resources that Ulrika just shared. And I guess the report that you shared is also, we can share further with participants, right? The report that you outlined now on alignment.
That's fine. Yeah, we're happy to share that.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you so much. Looking at the time, let's perhaps move to Bernard, and then we can come back to questions. And as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to write in the chat box if you have any questions. Meanwhile, Bernard, welcome again. Thank you so much for being here today with us. Bernard is the head of the environment mainstreaming and circular economy sector at the European Commission, Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development, or also known as DG DEFCO for everyone I'm more familiar with. And he has extensive experience in developing countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and latest, or since 2012, he was in Brussels in charge of forest sector, and since 2015 he's been heading the environment mainstreaming and circular economy. Bernard, the floor is yours. Are you here?
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm here, and very pleased to be in such a good company to start the day today. So indeed, like CEDA, the EU has a long experience of mainstreaming. We have been doing mainstreaming for probably the last 15 years or more. We have learned some lessons along the way. And that's what I will share today with you. I'm very happy to be able to share this with you. I will try to focus on eight key elements we believe are essential for successful mainstreaming. But before starting, we are convinced that mainstreaming is more important than ever with the challenges the world is facing and with the policy framework we have, and in particular the Sustainable Development Agenda. Mainstreaming has a key role to play, and mainstreaming is about putting sustainability at the heart of everything we do. As the EU, we have a large portfolio of cooperation. I would say roughly 5% of this portfolio goes to specific projects focusing on environment or climate policies. That means that the rest, the 95%, goes to other sectors, energy, agriculture, governance, and so on. And we realize more and more that, of course, the largest ecological footprint we have comes from these sectors. Taking the case of agriculture, for example, we all believe we need to act on agriculture in partner countries. It's key to development and food security. But we have to keep in mind that agriculture is the first driver of deforestation. Agriculture is the main cause of biodiversity loss, and agriculture is an important emitter of greenhouse gases. Not to mention also that agriculture is responsible for the use of 75% of the fresh water use of the global population. So agriculture as a key ecological footprint, protecting the environment and climate is also and mainly about transforming these sectors that have a large footprint, starting with agriculture. So the eight key elements to mainstreaming, and I have got 8 minutes. I will try to stick to these 8 minutes with the 8 key factors. So please move to the next slide. The first key factor we believe for successful mainstreaming in our respective agencies, and I hope you can learn a bit from our experience, is to have a strong policy commitments. That gives you a mandate to mainstream. Our mandate in the EU comes from the Treaty on the EU, which includes an article specifically on the obligation to integrate environment and climate issues into the definition and implementation of our policies. The 2030 agenda, of course, as well, provides all of us a very strong mandate to mainstream environment and climate across everything we do. I will not mention all the elements on this slide, but last but not least, for the EU, the European Green Deal is the flagship policy of this Commission. It puts climate neutrality and environmental sustainability at the heart of EU policies. So having a strong policy mandate like this is a key to advance the integration of environment and climate change. Next slide, please. What helps and helped us along the way as well, beyond the general policy mandate, is to have a very concrete target. And in our case, we have had a target and a commitment by the EU to spend at least 20% of its budget on climate-related actions. And we have also subscribed to the biodiversity commitment of Hyderabad to double biodiversity financing to developing countries. So these two commitments are and concrete targets are definitely helping us to convince colleagues on the need to integrate environment, biodiversity in this case, and climate change into everything we do. Next slide, please. A third factor, and I think, well, I started with the policy level. It's mainstreaming goes from the policy level up to the very implementation of our projects in the field. So it's also very important to embed these mainstreaming obligation and tools into your institutional processes in your respective agencies. It should not be left to each individual to decide what he does. Of course, we need to leave a lot of space for individual creativity, but the institutional processes need to foresee explicitly this need for integrating environment and climate change. Next slide, please. At the heart of our institutional processes and many of our agencies, I believe also the agencies in which participants to this webinar are working, is the cycle of our projects, and which is represented on this slide. And mainstreaming is very closely related to the cycle of operation. And what we have done, we have defined in the cycle of operation what we call entry points, which are the points in the cycle of operation which provide you opportunities to integrate environment and climate consideration into your projects. Actions, which is the action you have to take, and then tools. We have identified a number of tools that can help colleagues to integrate environment and climate change considerations. Next, please, which is policy dialogue, of course, is a key element. Policy dialogue goes for us, we try to put policy first, and at the end of the day, we believe that our cooperation main objective is to contribute to transform policies and their implementation. So policy work is key, and it goes all along the cycle. Next, and then along, thank you, along the cycle, we have designed a number of tools that can help us. The first one is when we start programming, meaning when we start defining of our program of cooperation with a particular country, it's very important that we start with a robust analysis of the environment and climate situation in respect of the sectors we want to cooperate in. So in the case of agriculture, looking at agriculture in the country, looking at the main environmental pressures on agriculture, climate change, for example, what impacts on the future of agriculture in the country, but also looking at the pressure that the sector we want to work in exert on the environment, on water resources, on biodiversity, and so on. So this robust analysis is key to inform your policy work, is key to inform your programs and your projects. So very important to start with it. If we go down the project cycle, the next stage for us is identification and formulation of particular projects. There we have a mandatory tool, which is an environment and climate risk screening. This is essential for a number of projects. You have to assess the risk of your project. And taking the case of agriculture, for example, if you want to support the construction of a large irrigation scheme, you need to assess the risk related to that. And this kind of project, large-scale irrigation scheme, goes through the screening, and based on the screening, it is decided to have a mandatory environmental impact assessment, which is also a key tool to integrate environmental concerns. So you assess the impacts of your irrigation scheme on the environment, and based on this, you define a number of measures you have to take in order to mitigate these impacts. So that's what we call the environmental management plan, which is another tool we have in our cycle of operation. That part relates to the design of our projects. Of course, beyond the design of the project, is very important to monitor the project impact on the environment and climate, and also possibly the positive impacts. And there, it's very important to include in your set of indicators that will measure this impact. So it's essential to monitor this throughout the monitoring and the evaluation. So again, these slides provide you with some examples of the tools we use, at least the main ones. Next slide, please. So as you have seen, environmental sustainability has to become a key guiding principle for all the work we do. And it's also, in this respect, mainstreaming is also about a change of mindset. It's really about putting sustainability at the heart of the way you think about your cooperation programs. We have also learned that starting early in the cycle of operation is key. If you do your mainstreaming at the very end of your project definition, your possibility to improve the design of your action will be extremely limited. If you put this concern at the very start of the definition of your operation, you have the opportunity not only to mitigate negative impacts of your action on the environment, but also to opt for solutions that have a transformative potential, that was mentioned by Ulrika in the previous presentation. So that's what we call moving from do no harm, meaning mitigating negative impact, to doing more good. So identifying these areas and these technologies that allow you to allows your project to have a transformative potential. And that's what we call putting a green lens approach to everything we do. Next slide, please. Of course, it's very important to guide your colleagues and to provide them with these tools. So that's why we have developed, like many other agencies, guidelines and a full toolbox of tools to support mainstreaming. These are available on the web, and I could happily share these guidelines with you. Our guidelines now date back to 2016, and we feel it's more than time to update them in order to align them better with the Green Deal, the Paris Agreement, and also to the new modalities of our cooperation. Increasingly, we are using investments. So we are using tools to leverage private sector investments and public investments. Our mainstreaming approaches need to evolve with these evolving modalities. Next slide, please. The seventh key factor is also to make mainstreaming everyone's responsibility. And that's not easy. Too often mainstreaming is left to a couple of experts in an office of the environment department of your institution. And that's not sufficient. Putting this green lens approach that I mentioned in the earlier slide really implies that everyone needs to take these considerations into its daily work. And for that purpose, establishing a network of focal points across your organization, across the different departments, and across your country offices can help a lot. And next slide, please. Finally, and not least, mainstreaming also requires significant expertise. It's not easy to identify and design how you can integrate environment and climate concerns into your operations. So what we have and what CEDA has as well is a facility of consultants that helps us and helps colleagues across headquarters and country offices to integrate environment and climate concerns. It involves a lot of awareness raising, as you can see, and information sharing, but also capacity building. We organize a lot of webinars these days, and formal trainings. But it's also reviewing each and every project proposal that goes through our institution at an early stage in order to advise colleagues on how they can better integrate environment and climate in these projects. So I think that was the last key element I wanted to highlight from our experience on what can help our agencies to do successful mainstreaming. I will be very happy to share some of these tools with you and further discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard. I think it was very, very, very nicely clear to everyone, the elements. We are slightly behind schedule, but I think now we can open the floor for questions. And we have about 10 minutes. And if our speakers are willing, we can take a few more. So yeah, I kindly ask you to open your videos, whoever was brave enough, as Gerd would say. And then, yeah, also please feel free to unmute your mic and ask a question. There was a question from Berna. Berna, do you want to ask your question in unmuting your mic? Berna? No. Okay. I'll read it out.
I responded to it in the chat.
Oh, you already responded to it. Okay.
But I can say what I responded if you like.
Yes, please. That would be great.
So what Berna wrote was, although the donors can have tools to measure the results of interventions, the capacities of the recipient countries to monitor the impact might be limited. How do these limitations impact the response, and how do donors design and report their interventions in these cases? And of course, that's super important. And as I wrote, I think it's very important to include activities and budgets in programs taking into account the limitations of recipient countries and also partners in the analysis we do before starting off any program. I think that's the way to go about it. But colleagues might have other replies or additions.
Yeah, Bernard, do you want to add something to that or not? I'm putting you on the spot here. No, it's no problem.
Really, but I see the other comment. If you allow me, are any of the new assessments available and could be used by other donors? Well, I believe so. Yes, definitely. We have standard terms of reference, for example, for EIAs and SEAs. We have a little guidebook that provides recommendations on how to carry out a successful SCA, and these kind of tools that we could share with the colleagues.
And may I add to that also that from CEDA's perspective, we share all our material, as I mentioned in the last slide, and in our green toolbox available for everyone. And there we have a step-to-step guide in terms of how you do an environmental assessment in 4 steps, and well, everyone is free to steal and use as much as you want from our material out there. So add that.
Thank you so much for the offer to steal, Ulrika. I think it's really the purpose of having this webinar where it's only 1 hour and there's obviously impossible to go through every detail, but opening the door for some of the colleagues to show where we can get more information. And I think what you showed in the CEDA's toolbox, and as well in Bernard's, there's a wealth of resource on EU's capacity for dev, right? The learning, there's so much resources available, including the DevCo Academy. For everyone, and not just today we're talking about mainstreaming environment and climate, but beyond that, whether it's on gender and all these other issues, you can find a lot of resources there. So I encourage everyone to check out those. The last thing we want to do is reinvent the wheel, right? When we have limited resources that we dedicating for development, and also the SDGs, only the decade of action, everything. So we want to be efficient, and yes, so please feel free to steal the existing resources, and of course, give credit. Is there another?
I saw a question now. As part of National Adaptation Plan project, we in Bosnia and Herzegovina, work with municipalities in preparation of climate change projects. Would it be possible to apply those projects to CEDA? Well, that I don't really get the question. So maybe that person want to speak up.
Hello, this is Jovanka. I have asked this question, Ulrika. This is just, I would like to get information. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We are implementing National Adaptation Plan project here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And as a part of that project, there is a component called climate change finances. And within that scope of work, we are working with municipalities, with local authorities, and trying to design the programs that are projects that are in compliance, completely in compliance with climate change. Before that, we did great big project, huge project with the other elements of climate change adaptation. So now we are at the stage of preparation, project proposals with them. So probably these proposals will go to Green Climate Fund or JEF or some others. But my question is whether these local authorities, like local governments, would be eligible, for example, to apply to see the grant allocated for climate change measures.
Well, we are open to any suggestions. You always, as I don't know, for CEDA, we don't have certain dates when you can apply for funds.
Yeah.
It's a continuous process, and what guides our development cooperation in your particular case is our strategy guiding our work in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So if it fits within that, and if it's you could definitely be in touch with CEDA, and the embassy in terms of that, and then they can assess the proposal. And
thank you very much. We are in compliance with the strategy and CEDA strategy here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But just but again, we can contact CEDA representation and the agency.
Please do.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if this is an excellent opportunity to ask questions. I mean, excellent opportunity for 2 minutes. So who would like to take the last chance? I mean, we have CEDA represented and EU represented, and obviously CEDA and EU, you have, and obviously OECD as well. So it's very advanced, I understand, for some of our partner donors. But on the other hand, it was very refreshing to hear that even CEDA has things that they need to do, you know. So I think we all need to work, and that's nice to realize that you know, none of us is, let's say, there in terms of when it comes to environment and climate. Just looking at the way our state of environment is. Thank you for sharing the link, Bernard, in the chat box for capacity for development community of practice with the wealth of resources that I was mentioning earlier. So questions? No more? Calling once, twice?
I do have one.
Yes.
Yes, and it's actually from my OECD colleagues, but I think it's for the wider audience. Because you mentioned the top-down and the bottom-up approaches, and it seems quite clear in the examples that you provided. But my question would be, in the practices of other donors, is it always so clear as it is a top-down or a bottom-up approach, or in reality, in most donors, it's a mix of the two?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sydney. Very good question. It's what we can tell. It's oftentimes it is a mix, but as donor countries and development cooperation providers are really thinking of like, how can we do this? That's some sort of like distinctions that we did see, but it's not necessarily exclusive. Yeah. And I think that's also with the Paris Agreement, because in the Paris Agreement, you have this dual approach as well. The top down with the temperature goals that you have, and then the bottom up, because how can we reach the temperature goals through country action? And I think that's also reflected in how development cooperation providers are approaching the issue.
Well, maybe next year we will be talking about CBD alignment. After the, I mean, probably all of you know that it was unfortunately postponed to next year, but I think the COVID has clearly illustrated the importance of nature, and I think it's, you know, all of our gains in development can be wiped out in a very, very short period of time if we do not take care of our of the nature that we actually depend on, not vice versa. That the nature doesn't depend on us. So on that very positive note, if there are no further questions, I would like to thank you all very much for joining us today. And a special thanks to our 4 speakers for being with us. It was very, very enlightening and illuminating and informative. Thank you so much. And please, everyone else, I encourage you to check out the websites that was shared. There's much more. Today was just appetizer, so to say. And yeah, please join us next week again, same time, same day, Thursday, same time, 11 a.m. Istanbul, for the continuation of this discussion, namely mainstreaming environment and climate. We will have representatives from the UN. Yannicka is here with us, actually. So Yannicka will share the model approach, UN model approach on this topic as well. We will have colleagues from the Slovak Republic and Austria sharing their experiences and tools. And you will be in the very able hands of Sydney right here. Sydney will be hosting and moderating the upcoming 2 webinars. And then we will have Ivan and Anna and Veronica, so other colleagues from UNDP and OECD moderating the upcoming webinars. So I will see you as a moderator at the very end of our ODA learning series on 26th of November. So until then, wish you all a very good Thursday, and please do join us in the coming Thursdays. And yeah, thank you very much again.